Welcome. Welcome to the Ministry Forum podcast, coming to you from the Center for Lifelong Learning at Knox College, where we connect, encourage, and resource ministry leaders all across Canada as they seek to thrive in their passion to share the gospel. I am your host, the Reverend John Borthwick, Director of the Center and Curator of all that is ministryforum.ca. I absolutely love that I get to do what I get to do, and most of all, that I get to share it all with all of you. So thanks for taking the time out of your day to give us a listen, whether you're a seasoned ministry leader or just beginning your journey. This podcast is made with you in mind. Welcome to the Ministry Forum podcast. We're so delighted to be talking with the moderator of the 149th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the Reverend Dr. Patricia Dutcher-Walls. You are in for a treat. As I have mentioned to Pat on a couple of occasions, with the utmost of respect to all previous moderators, I really feel that Pat's approach to the moderatorial role has been unique, and I'm hopeful that we're going to hear a little more about that as we talk to her today. Let me offer a brief introduction before I invite Pat to highlight those things that she would most like to share with us as a bit of an introduction. But let me just say that her official bio, starts in a beautiful way. It mentions that she is an active session member and minister in association with Trinity Church, a 3-congregation amalgamation and transformational ministry in New Westminster and Burnaby, British Columbia. She retired as professor of Hebrew Bible and the dean of the faculty of the Vancouver School of Theology on July 1st, 2021. Several decades of the Presbyterian Church in Canada students, first at Knox College, where I served as one of the representatives on the student search committee that brought Pat to Knox in the first place, and then at Vancouver School of Theology, have probably begun their study of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, drawing a map of ancient Israel, and figuring out their interpretive principles in her introductory year-long course. I think I missed this experience as I had taken my Intro to Hebrew Bible with Dan Eptison. He was the interim professor before Pat came. I think I had a prophet's course maybe with you, Pat. I'm pretty sure, but the memory is fading. Time is marching on. There is much more to say about Pat's experience in the church, and I'm confident that we will tease much more out from our conversation today. Welcome, Pat. It's so great to have you on the Ministry Forum podcast.
Thank you, John. It's great to be with you and great to talk through the technology with the folks who listen to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. Let's start with a little more about you. How would you want to introduce yourself? I've touched on a few things from the PCC website, but maybe there's some other things you'd want to share with our audience.
I guess the main thing is how much my whole career has really been defined as a teacher. I just sort of discovered early on that I really loved teaching. And while I felt called to ministry, I really felt that that ministry was going to find its best expression through teaching. So kind of as I was doing my MDiv and sorting out what I wanted to do when I grew up and things like that, um, I had a chance actually right after I did my MDiv to be a chaplain at a university in upstate New York. I was still in the States at that point, and I was an assistant chaplain at Colgate University, which is a great hockey team, by the way. And that job was great because it was half-time ministry on the college campus. So there was a campus church, and I was the assistant minister in the church. So it was an ordainable position. I was ordained to it. But the other half-time was teaching in the philosophy and religion department. And they kind of had a great books course that they had lots and lots of people teach, and was able to actually be in that classroom and teach. And that showed me that I really loved teaching. And that was a really nice revelation because I didn't know whether I wanted to go into ministry per se or into teaching. And so being in a university classroom really showed me I love teaching. And that then really shaped my career. Because at that point I said, all right, well, if I'm going to teach at a university or graduate level, I have to get a doctorate. And the only thing I really loved well enough to do a doctorate in was Old Testament. So I went on to do a doctorate in Old Testament in California and at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And that was a great experience. Lived there for 10 years, did a ridiculously long doctorate because I was getting married and having children in the middle of also putting my husband through 2 master's degrees. So between us, we have way too many graduate degrees and 2 lovely children who are now adults. And I finished my doctorate, and then my first job, my first, called job as a newly minted PhD was to Knox College. And that
Oh,
was a fateful turn of events. My husband had previously done a degree at the Toronto School of Theology, and he knew Toronto was a great city. And Reverend Dr. Art Van Cedars was the principal at that point. And he, for one, he really wanted to hire a woman because Knox had never hired a woman. Helen Goggin was there, and she had come with the amalgamation with Ewart, but they'd never hired a woman into a tenure track position. And by the charter, the person had to be Presbyterian, which I am, born, bred, raised, married, etc., Presbyterian. So that was just a lovely turn of events. We loved living in Toronto. I had a great time teaching at Knox. But both my husband and I always wanted to get back to the West Coast because we had met at Berkeley, and Berkeley is like a Southern Vancouver in a way. It's kind of that West Coast vibe. So when the Old Testament job at Vancouver School of Theology opened up, I applied for it and felt very blessed to get that job. And so then I've been at VST for the rest of my time. So I've actually been in Canada for 30 years, which feels amazing. But that also means I've done, as you say, a number of generations of students have learned their interpretive principles and drawn that map.
so amazing. And I don't think I'm sure I knew way back when, but I don't think I ever asked you, where were you born in the US? Like, where did you sort of grow
I
up
was
and what was your
born,
first degree?
yeah, I was born just outside New York City, in
Okay.
a suburb in New Jersey. My dad worked in the city. He was one of those commuters to the city. And it was a
Right.
great place to grow up, because the culture was influenced by the city. And like when we would go on a school field trip, we'd go into New York City to the, Metropolitan Museum or whatever. So it was great, to grow up there. And my family was very Presbyterian. My dad was an elder. My mom was a deacon. They both sang in the choir. So I was just, surrounded by thoughtful, faithful Presbyterians. It was a suburban kind of a church, but the minister, I think, probably spent more time on his sermons than just about anyone I know. They were very thoughtful. And the other
Wow.
thing is, he spent a lot of time on his prayers. When he did a pastoral prayer,
Mm,
you knew he had really put his heart into it
mm,
as how he would pray for his congregation. So
mm,
that was a great influence to be aware of. So um, that shaped who I am in many ways, kind of subtle ways, because it wasn't a flashy kind of upbringing. It was an upbringing in the church that valued thoughtfulness and, you know, thinking through things, and doubt was okay because then you just do more thinking. And that was a good influence, especially for somebody who's then going to go into teaching and hopefully model a kind of faith that's not afraid of the brain that God gave us. That
mm,
I really pretty firmly believe that God gave us brains and God wanted us to engage with, thoughtfully, with the Bible, with our experience with God, with our experience in the world. And so my upbringing, I think, shaped how I do Presbyterianism. And then I found kind of a happy place in deciding that, I think my gifts are best suited to teaching in a seminary. And luckily that worked out. I had the wherewithal and the support of family and my husband to, do the long slog that it takes to get a doctorate. And then and my husband's a Lutheran pastor, so his job was always flexible. We could literally go where my job, because there's not that many teaching jobs, so he was willing to follow me wherever I needed to go in terms of jobs. He was delighted to move to Canada. And believe me, we have been so glad to be living in Canada. And we are even more glad right now. So, right, we'll leave the rest unspoken, but there you go.
We could imagine there could be some reasons. Yeah. Yeah, I fascinating, yeah, to see how the journey goes, growing up and then thinking, seeing that discernment of your call towards, teaching and then
Hmm.
teaching in a seminary
Right,
and then, being a California couple, and then
right.
just have your husband having that connection with Toronto
Yeah,
and
with Toronto,
maybe
it
that
was,
opening your
yeah,
mind to those kind of
yeah,
things. That's
yeah.
amazing because I'm assuming maybe that wouldn't have been the first thought, but maybe the connection between Toronto School of Theology or VST and Graduate Theological Union, maybe there's a
Well,
sense in that world
we
and
had
culture that's a space you could go.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
had heard, of course, of both VST. I mean, you can't be in the theological world circle is not that big. So
yeah,
if you're at G2, you've heard of Toronto, you've heard of VST. I wouldn't have imagined necessarily moving to Canada, but the job was perfect because one of the other
mhm,
things I've discovered about where I think I thrive and where I can teach well is when I'm in a school that has denominational connections, but it's in an ecumenical context. Um, I don't know that I would have been happy at a school that was only Presbyterian and, kind of insular in their outlook.
mm,
So I knew that was what was very attractive about Toronto School of Theology is that I came into Knox College, which was very Presbyterian and proudly so and deeply so for many, many years. But it was right there in the middle of the university and right there in the middle of the Toronto School of Theology, which is an ecumenical school. So I was so glad when it got to teaching like that prophets course that, yes, you may very well have been in. It was one of my upper level courses. That was it was a survey of the prophets. So a lot of students from the other schools. So Toronto School of Theology has, I don't know, you may remember, but 6 or 7 different schools. And they're, Catholic and Anglican and United, and they allow cross registration. So my classes would have a core of Presbyterians, of course, but then there were always students from all of the other schools, and it was so rich in the classroom. And I realized I couldn't sort of imagine learning theology any other way.
mm,
Because if you're only exposed to one way of thinking about the world, you may get a little bit arrogant about whether that's the only way to think about things.
mm,
But if you're learning in a context where you have other points of view, so you're always wrestling, you're always being exposed to another way to interpret this passage, and then my own sort of predilection to make students think about their interpretation could really work. Because so if you're sitting there in a classroom and there's somebody, say, from Korea or India or where else, who has a very different interpretation of a particular passage, each student's job is to figure out, well, how am I interpreting? And then how do I be generous with people who have different interpretations? It can't be that we go to a place like a Toronto School of Theology to shut out the world as we're learning. It's far better to go there and be open to what there is to learn from others, because, in fact, that's what ministry is going to be about. And if we spend our time at a school shutting ourselves off and then get into a ministry situation where, actually, in fact, there's a mosque up the street that's having trouble with the city over the size of their parking lot, we actually may want to be in an interfaith discussion with that mosque. And in fact, we may want to work with them on some ministry in the neighborhood, and we may want to support their bid for their parking lot or their building or whatever, because it's in a situation, a country like Canada, where any religion thrives and all religions thrive. I think we're actually healthier and better for that. And we can be better Christians. by being in good communication with our interfaith neighbors. And so it's really ideal, I think, for my teaching career to have ended up in an urban area, in an interfaith, ecumenical kind of place in Toronto, and then that just continued in Vancouver.
Yeah, for sure. And my own experience being in Toronto was my first call in Toronto at Rexdale, and within a few years of my early ministry, September 11th happened,
Yeah.
and right around the corner from our church was a very significant mosque
Mm,
that were and folks in that community who were experiencing lots of targeted hate
mm.
crime and abuse and things like that. And so one of my first things that I did was reach out in the days when we actually wrote letters still. So funny. Um,
Yeah.
I wrote a letter to their community and just offering sort of a solidarity and
Mhm.
support in the those of us in the Abrahamic faith
Right.
tradition,
Yeah.
leaning into that. And I was actually invited to come and be a part of
Oh, good.
the open house and a community service of solidarity for that community after such a thing
Right.
happens. And I'm sure lots of folks in ministry have those encounters of, where do
Right.
I how do
Right.
I stand alongside my interfaith brothers and sisters, but also my siblings in my interdenominational connections as
Right.
well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing
And I
experience.
think that's, I'm sure that happens elsewhere in the world. And given the diversity of, say, US culture now, that would be the case. And I think it's worldwide. But perhaps, and here I'll be a little bit Canadian, we may experiment well with models on how to do that well.
Hmm.
Because it's not that one loses one's own identity. It's,
Hmm.
in fact, my experience has been that being in an intercultural, interfaith situation, you actually need to know your own identity better, but you hold it lightly and you interact with your neighbors generously. And that is, I think, then that creates actually a civic generosity that I think serves everybody well and that I find actually quite compatible with the gospel. That,
Hmm.
that is that kind of openness, which doesn't mean we lose ourselves, but being open to the other and, in fact, being aware that their experience is quite different than ours and listening to what their experience is and allowing that to help me think about my experience and my commitments and my values is actually important, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Yeah, and that certainly spurred on for my entire ministry, both in Toronto and in the city of Guelph. Just finding ways of having those interconnections. Even in the city of Guelph, we did the first ever, at least for our Habitat for Humanity chapter, the first ever. We called it My Neighbor's House, and it was an interfaith build. So
Oh,
tried to get
okay.
as many interfaith partners and Christian partners together to raise some funds towards building a Habitat for
That's
Humanity home in our
that's a
city. And
yeah,
yeah, it
good
was fun.
model. That's great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, it was
very
good
good.
stuff.
Yeah.
Um, okay, let's think about other kinds of discernment. Did you ever think you'd grow up in living in just around New Jersey? Did you ever think you'd become the Presbyterian Church in Canada's moderator of the 149th General Assembly? Like that was
No.
just in your
Yeah. That
bucket
was in my
list.
bucket list there,
Please make
even
that
as a
happen for me,
10-year-old.
Lord. I'm praying someday this will be my role.
No.
What did you think it would be like when this came into your life, and what has surprised you? So, yeah,
Yeah.
thinking about that.
Um, so I had thought about it for a number of years. I'd actually quite a few years ago, my name had stood one time for moderator, didn't win at that time, which at that moment it was like, thank God I didn't get it. Because
I love those
I still
moments.
had,
I love
a
those moments. Yeah.
teenager at home and it was just like, nope, this isn't gonna work.
Mm,
Um, and I guess I do understand it as a call that it's a particular ministry. Obviously, not many people get elected to it. It's one a year. Um, so it's a small group, but I do think and thought as I was considering whether to let my name stand, I I did, you think, can I practically fit it in? How busy am I? How will it affect my family? How will it affect the other work that I'm doing? Now I'm retired, so that certainly relieved a little bit of scheduling pressure, but I'm very, very active in my local church and my presbytery. So there was an impact. I had to, say to people, there's certain things I can't do this year because I'm moderator. But I guess the thought was, do I have something to offer that the church might recognize as something that's worth having for this year? But with all calls in the Presbyterian Church, as you will have heard Stephen Farris say, a call is always a two-key operation. Both the person and the presbytery have to agree to the call, or the ordination, and then the call has to be the church that's called, the ordaining presbytery, and the person. And I think the call to being moderator is similar. So I may want to be moderator, and the church may not discern, and the Holy Spirit may not lead the church to discern that this is the time for this, or that I have the skills. So it was always, we'll see. And I, kind of held the decision lightly, because if it didn't work out, I had wonderful work to do. I wasn't going to be moping around. I had a full and wonderful life that was just going to continue, of service to the church. So I was pleasantly surprised when I got the call from the clerk, from Victor Kim, that said yes. It was like, oh, okay, wow, that actually happened. Which is, both fun and a little funny and a little intimidating. So, is it as I expected? Well, part of it is, since I've never been moderator before, I didn't actually know what to expect. Everybody comes to this job, this calling, without actually knowing what it's like. And for all that the General Assembly office is very gracious, it very much tries to, prepare you for what you're going to be up against, and describe, it's about like a half-time job, and there's travel. You don't know until you're living it what it's like. Um, but my family was okay with it, because the travel is probably the thing that impacts the family as much as the most. And my husband was like, I mean, he's got his own set of volunteer work, and he's okay. I mean, he's not thrilled that I'm traveling as much as I am, but he's fine with it. And he is coming along on, he did the international trip when I went to Malawi in August. And then we have an upcoming trip, or I have an upcoming trip to the Maritimes, and he'll come along on that one. So some of the longer trips. Now, we lived in Ontario long enough. He was like, no, I don't need to go visit Ontario. That's okay. You can just go do that. So anyway, it does have an impact on the family, but he seemed fine with that, and then also does some trips with me. Was it what I'm expected? To a certain extent, yes. So you get a lot of invitations, and where you can work those into a trip, you do. I think one of the things that is a little bit different is, if you're a Vancouver resident, being moderator is a little bit different, because you basically have to get on an airplane to go anywhere for any of your visits or whatever. I mean, I did one trip over to Vancouver Island, which is hop on a ferry, and that was easy. That's local. And of course, I've done a couple of things in my home presbytery here. But anything else, you have to get on a plane and go somewhere. So that is a little bit different than if you're in Southern Ontario. There are so many Presbyterians there. You can hop in a car, and within a couple hours, you can visit, a number of different churches for services or whatever. So what we've tried to do is bunch up invitations so that I could do a trip to Alberta or Southern Ontario or Winnipeg or wherever it is that I'm going, and have enough items bunched together on dates that work with each other, but then don't mean that I'm not on the road for 4 weeks at a time. It just wasn't going to happen. That wasn't going to be healthy for my family or for me. So so the travel has been, and the General Assembly office has been very good about that. So the travel is pretty much as I expected. And because I could, have some say in, well, let's say no to that one because I really can't be traveling at this point, but let's say yes to this one. So that was pretty much as I expected. The other thing that I realized kind of almost immediately was, all right, look, they being the General Assembly, they just elected a professor. So they're going to get a professor. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. Of course, I'm also a minister. I've been ordained since 1978. So, absolutely, ministry is important to me. But my calling has been as a teacher. So, I was thinking, even early on during the General Assembly, how I could put my own calling, my own vocation as a teacher to good use as the moderator. And what I realize is that my thing, if for anybody who's ever been in a class or a workshop with me, is helping people learn and discuss in a way that encourages everybody's participation so that we all learn from each other, and that the best way to do that is in a workshop format where small groups get together. And I set up, if you will, the learning experience in a way that's going to encourage small groups to talk to each other and then to reflect together on what they've heard and what they've learned. I mean, that's the, if you will, every class I've ever put together, that's the educational philosophy that I use in classes. And so I thought, well, I'm going to bring that to the national stage because that's who I am. That's who you elected. So I mean, I think we'll maybe talk about a little later. The General Assembly also passed an initiative through Assembly Council for kind of looking at the renewal and vitality of the church called the Working Group on Narratives of Hope and Possibility. And that was passed at the General Assembly when I was moderator last June. And it's a year-long project that the working group has 20 or so people from across the country, very representative, and they're working on how do we bring vitality back to the church? What are some new models? How do we create narratives of hope and possibility for the church as a whole? And they have a national strategy that they're thinking through. And so even before they really got started, at General Assembly last year, I talked to the chairperson, who's Reverend Dr. Jean Morris, and then, of course, Victor Kim, the clerk. And I said, if there's anything I can do to run a set of workshops that go alongside, complement the work that the National Committee is doing, that feels like part of my calling as a moderator, because that's something that I can contribute that uses my gifts and skills and that might be useful to the working group. And they readily agreed. And then Jean Morris and I, over the summer, actually worked out what this workshop might be. And that's, I think, a little different from other roles moderators have played. Partly, I mean, I have done less of the preaching at anniversaries, which is a lovely thing to do. And moderators often get, well, even I got lots of invitations. But because I was connecting with the church through the workshop format, I did less of the anniversaries and preaching engagements, and then created this series of these workshops as my engagement with the church, as my service, I think, to the church this year. And that has been a little bit different, I think, than other moderators using that more workshop format to interact with people. It doesn't mean I haven't done preaching. I have. It's just, I think I've done less preaching and then added these workshops in. So that's one distinction. The other distinction, and here again, I'm not sure, but it feels like I'm doing more writing than other moderators might do. They always have the moderators write an article for each issue of Connections. It comes out 4 times a year. But as it turned out, I already had other writing projects going on that happened then during this year. So
Mm.
a number of congregations will be using the Lent, PWS&D Lent liturgies. Well, I happen to have written the Lent liturgies that people are using this year. That was a complete fluke.
Mm.
It was, on the schedule, and I had been writing them even before I got elected moderator. And then a year or so ago, I had written the Bonhoeffer study that was the Advent Presbyterian Read. And I think, my sense is, and Callie Long, who's the head of the communications department, can correct me, I think they discovered that I'm a writer. It's hard to be a professor and not be a writer because it's part of your job as a professor. So they discovered I could write, and they kind of keep saying, "Well, why don't you write this and why don't you write that?" And I've been mostly glad. I mean, sometimes it's too much, and I've had to say an occasional no. But
Mhm.
I like writing, and I think it is again a service, a gift I can give to the church. So I've maybe done a little bit more writing than other moderators, um, but that again has suited what people were going to get when they elected a professor as a moderator. So that's a long
Definitely.
answer, but there you
No, it's
go.
good. Anything that surprised you in this role so far? Like, you've still got a few more months left. There's maybe some more surprises on the horizon, but
Yeah, there could be.
but anything
Um,
so far that's kind of like, wow, I didn't think
yeah,
that would happen, or I never thought I'd be in this room, or whatever that might
right.
be.
Yeah, I think one thing in particular. So it was in January, and I had to write the third article for Connections. So the first one was about the narratives of hope and possibility because I wanted to introduce that idea. That came out. I wrote in the summer, came out in the fall. The next article, of course, I mean, just naturally had to be about my trip to Malawi because I had lots of pictures and people need to hear about what international ministries and PWSD is doing. But then I got to this third one. It was early January. The deadline was something like January 10 or something. It's after Christmas. Everybody's kind of like "Ugh," tired. And I'm like, okay, now blank page. What am I going to write about? And I started reflecting on my role as moderator and particularly what I had heard already through the workshops that I had done in the fall and what the impact of the changes in culture and our times and whatever it's having on the church, both in terms of discouragement for some churches, how difficult it is to be church, excitement for other churches of like, wow, there's a whole new ministry here. So reflecting on that, and then my own church is an amalgamation, and we haven't stood still in 5 years. I mean, it's been constant change because that's what amalgamation is. You are constantly figuring out, I mean, you're like one step ahead of whatever it is you have to do, and you're trying to plan for the future, but then something else happens. So I was reflecting on change in the church and realizing that there are many people for whom change is very difficult. They kind of have an expectation that the church will always be there for them in the way they have always expected it to be there, that it's not going to change because they also have this theology that God doesn't change. So I was just reflecting on change. And I realized that kind of in the midst of these reflections and some prayer and whatever, that all of a sudden I was feeling like I was pastor for the whole church in Canada, that I had become the pastoral counselor, if you will, but just I had a pastoral charge, and that pastoral charge is the entire Presbyterian Church in Canada, which is kind of what the moderator is when you think about it. If the moderator is a minister in that sense, then the whole church is one's parish. And that struck me very, very deeply that I have, in some sense, and I don't want to overblow this because it's not a on me alone, but it is the sense that a moderator's calling is to take care for and with the whole church. And that was kind of a lovely experience and completely unexpected. Now, I was at a LMA meeting this past week, and Amanda Curry was there, who, of course, had been a past moderator. And I was speaking with her, and she said, "Oh, yeah, she had that too." That all moment. Now, for her, it was, I think, even more because she was the moderator during COVID. And so
Mhm.
she ended up being moderator for 2 years, and she really felt like she was the pastor to a church that, of course, was very deeply thrown off balance by the whole pandemic experience. So it was just good to hear that another moderator had kind of that sense because I didn't know whether I was like, kind of getting too big for my britches there, or feeling like taken on more than I should be. But
Mhm.
anyway, I think that's been the most surprising thing, that one can feel a pastoral concern for a group of people as large as an entire denomination.
Mhm.
But that's what happened.
Yeah. Well, and I think it bears out, Pat, related to um, the world of secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. you
Right.
know, once if your approach is to, um, I'll speak about sort of my experience sometimes with now being somebody who does pulpit supply. When you go and do pulpit supply in a place, yeah, you're going to have chats and you're going to have some interactions. You could even have a really heavy interaction at some point, like with somebody, just because you're a person who's a minister type and you did the sermon that day or you were a part of leading worship. But then there's sort of a release of like, right, okay, see you later. I might never see you again. It's been great. um, but I think when you open yourself up as you have to bear witness to people's experiences and using the lens of the Bible, where sometimes when we talk about the Bible, I'm sure you'd be all over this,
Right.
it brings up stuff for us. And then
Right.
and then you're making those connections with folks around their experience of their church experience and the future of the church and their faith and all those things. And you're just holding space for that. And and you're inviting that through your writing. And so yeah, I could easily see how you would be taking on that extra, maybe perhaps weight
Mhm.
as a part of that. And so what a gift you've given to the church,
Yeah.
but of course, take care of yourself as you do that
Yes.
and decompress from that in the
Right.
coming months ahead. But yeah, I think that's a great gift to the church as well, to have that sense of um, that you are almost processing through and certainly sharing through your writing and sharing through your engagement in meetings and the
Right.
connections with the Hope and Possibilities working group, um, what you're hearing and
Right.
transferring that where you go. And so you're sort of the conduit for that and also
Mhm.
the messenger for that,
Right.
maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's a good way, and thank you. And I think that's a good way to describe it. And I think it really is being a servant to the church. I mean, it's
Hmm.
service. Um, and that's fine. That's actually a good way of describing the job of moderator.
Hmm.
So I'm glad that it's worked out that way. I didn't, when I said to Jean Morris, I'll do a workshop. It's like, didn't, you never quite know, because if you do a workshop well, you actually don't know what's going to come up. You don't try to
Hmm.
direct it. You kind of create a container where people can explore their own thoughts, and you don't, at least I don't, try to direct what those thoughts are, because I think that would be a betrayal of the trust I'm trying to create in those workshops. So if you're trusting the group and it can go, one way or another, it's like you got to be ready for anything. Keeps you flexible. There's no doubt about that. Um, but if you do it well in that sense, you do become a facilitator of people's thoughts and questions and hopes and dreams and discouragements. And that's a pretty much a sacred role. In my, that is actually a pastoral, sacred kind of role, where I always have the sense that, yes, it's me in the room doing the leadership, but in these workshops and in interactions with people, it's also the Spirit being invited into that space and becoming part of those conversations, so that people are free, I think, in a way, to say things that they might not say in another context. And I think that freedom in the Spirit to actually express how it is we see the church today, our church, our home congregation, the future of the church at large, or for the presbytery or whatever it is, that those are holy conversations. And the Spirit is present. We invite the Spirit in, and we do well to do that, because it's this is Christ's church, not ours. So let's just, let the Spirit go where it will and kind of go along for the ride, and actually keep open to listening to each other, which I think is one of the ways the Spirit actually moves, is when we listen to each other well. And it's not so much the Spirit isn't necessarily directing what people say, but the Spirit is enlivening the openness in the room to hear what other people are saying in a way that's not just analytical, but it kind of includes the whole person. So it's your hopes and your dreams and your emotions and your discouragements and your excitement. And that is then creates a holy conversation, and that the
Mm.
Spirit is very much present in that. So to be the servant of that is tremendously honoring, and just I just have loved that role.
It's amazing that you've been able to see it that way and hold space for folks in that way. We'll get to hope and possibilities in a sec, but maybe just in your experience thus far, and you're going to, I think
Mhm.
you'd said you're going to the Maritimes
Right,
in the month to come, or
right, yeah.
in the coming months, and just from those conversations that you've been able to have, or what you've seen in the spaces you've occupied within our denomination, um, what kind of insights have you gleaned?
Yeah.
What does it look like out there in the field from your vantage point? How are we
Yeah,
doing? How are we doing?
yeah. Well,
Whatever you'd like to share into
yeah.
that space. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I did an interesting exercise where I sat down and I actually read the Acts and Proceedings in the section where they have the lists of the presbyteries, and they talk about all the pastoral charges and who's the minister there, et cetera, who's the clerk of session, et cetera, and how many of them are vacant. And I read through the whole, like, however many of them there are, many, many, many pages. And it's a sobering realization how many churches are vacant and how many presbyteries are small, and the presbytery itself is getting smaller as churches close. How many you have a sense that, there's more vacancies than in a particular presbytery, perhaps, than there are ordained ministers to be interim moderators. So we, in some ways of looking at it, the church, is thin on the ground. That said, there are incredible stories and examples of people holding a space and a place for the sacred, for worship, that has gone back hundreds of years, that literally their grandparents and great grandparents built or added to or were part of. And so that legacy, that trust from generations past, I think is one of the strengths of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. That we do have a sense that really from the founding of Canada, there have been Presbyterian congregations praying for the good of the order, praying for the good of their neighbors, um, building not only buildings, but institutions and practices that shape communities. And that legacy is incredible and it carries on. So that sense of the longevity of the traditions that we hold is very precious. That said, that legacy is now up against cultural changes that are making it very, very difficult to keep that legacy alive if it's dependent on a building that's the same age as the legacy and getting to be in the hundreds of years or even, less than that. And the building itself is saying, you got to pay attention to me. I need a new roof, and I've got a leak, and I've got a this. And that instead of at borders, instead of becoming a legacy, it becomes a burden. And that is an incredibly difficult transition because the buildings in which many people invest a lot of their identity in their building. And in some cases, that's because literally their family story is invested in that building of their grandparents or whatever. And it's very, very, very difficult for people to see how a church survives without the building that they love, or without the building in a particular way. And then that's where the perception that change is difficult really comes clashing up against what may be some of the necessities for the church surviving. And that church is not necessarily a building. That church is the witness and work of Jesus Christ in the world, which is facilitated sometimes by buildings. It's facilitated by groups of people working together. It's facilitated by people called to ministry, either as teaching elders or as ruling elders in the case of lay people, which may or may not have anything to do with a building. So when the building becomes a burden instead of a literally something that facilitates, then churches have very difficult situations. So that's one piece that I've seen kind of happening across the country. The other is that there are generations now around us, our kids and our grandkids and whatever, who maybe didn't grow up in church or maybe have only a cursory awareness of church, and they don't have the kind of need for joining. I mean, I talk to my kids and I talk to other kids and their, folks in their 20s and 30s, and joining something isn't necessarily a plus for them. Being a part of something, I mean, they do talk about wanting to be in community, but a membership list doesn't necessarily, unless it's like to the gym, you might become a member of a gym. So I think there's a lot that's changed. The culture is, and then others have said this better than I'm saying it. The culture is more secular. So that, I think, combined with aging buildings and then aging congregations in a secular culture, is a difficult time of transition for the church. It's not impossible, but it's going to require things of us that we're not well practiced at, which is change and flexibility and just like actually trusting the Spirit to do something different among us, when all of our instincts sometimes are, but this is what's worked in the past. Can't that just work now? And it's difficult to hear that the answer is maybe it can't work that way anymore. Doesn't mean the Spirit's not at work, but maybe new ways of expressing our mission, our faith, our connections with the neighborhood are going to be needed. And my sense is the congregations or amalgamations of congregations or the whatever, patterns that can create a center of gravity large enough to have the energy to cope with the changes that are needed is going to be key. Because when a church gets too old and too tired, there just literally are not the bodies and there's not the energy to cope with what is going to be required. And that's when your local congregation runs the risk of just not, the roof goes and they're done. They don't have the money, they don't have the energy, they don't have the wherewithal to confront it. So part of, I think, what's going to be needed is creating pockets or new communities of people where either through yoking parishes, 2-point charges, 3-point charges, amalgamations, not only within Presbyterianism, but join with the United and the Lutheran Church down the street to do a new ministry. So it's going to require creativity in finding and creating communities that are a big enough center of gravity, in that, to use that, I guess it's a physics image, to have enough energy to create something new. A tiny little church on its own is not going to be able to do that. That church, together with some other churches, whether those are Presbyterians or whatever, may create enough center of gravity that then change becomes possibility rather than threat. And that, I think, is going to be a key to the future.
Wow. That's yeah. That's a lot to think. I've got so many things that are popping in my brain. I'll just mention that on the Ministry Forum podcast, we had a chance to interview Dr. Sandra Beardsall
Yep,
from the uh, Prairie Center for Ecumenism.
I think
I think
so.
that's what it's
Yeah,
called. Um, Amazing conversation, just talking about those shared ecumenical shared ministries.
yep.
I'd agree, Pat, that so we have to look at. We also sometimes might have to look at different new dancing partners,
Hmm.
even if the other Presbyterian church in town, if there is a second one, isn't the partner that wants to
Right.
dance. If there's others that want to dance, then
Yeah.
go for it. And then other communities that she was talking about where there are no other,
Right.
of your team around,
Right.
but there's
Right.
a variety in a town or
Yeah.
in a region that could work well together.
Right.
I know when you visited Knox College, you said something about stump the professor. That's not the intent of what just came into my brain, but I wonder, and I'm not even sure what I'm formulating, but there were three sort of key things you talked about in that answer you were giving, and it just jumped out to me like as a professor of the Hebrew Bible, I'm seeing a sort of a thought around um, for a people in the Hebrew Bible who place and building and temple were so very important to them,
Right.
and disruptions that occurred when they were pulled away from those things
Right.
or those things were destroyed. Not just temple, but even just when the ark gets taken away,
Yeah.
just this sort of sense of the holiness of place and space, and that we go back to the well where our ancestors
Right.
had possession of this well, and that has such great meaning within the story of the Hebrew people. Um, the other one that came to mind was teach your children. You know, the
Hmm.
Deuteronomistic stuff around
Yep.
teach your children this stuff, and the interconnected to that, knowing some. I mean, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I'm just going with the pieces of the gleanings that I've had as a good pastor over the years, who's read my Bible and tried to preach this stuff to people. If that was formulated a little more or even tightened during the exile experience
Hmm.
of the people of Israel, and then the last one was like the aging generation. And again, I think
Mm.
I'm connecting all these things to
Right.
exile, but
Right.
I'm wondering if even there's other percolations within the story of the Hebrew Bible that sort of says, as a people of faith within the big story of God, we've been here before
Oh yeah.
in a variety of different settings. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wonder if you could throw down in your Hebrew Bible professor ways and just sort of give us that,
Yeah.
maybe those percolations of hope that come from knowing that,
Yeah.
hey, people have been here before.
Yeah.
People of faith have been here before, and
Yeah.
here's where they came.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question. I think there's one way of looking at the Hebrew Bible, and I would continue it into the New Testament as well, because there's never a time, or rarely a time, let's put this, there's rarely a time when everything's so settled that you never have to worry about things again. And at the point where that happens, you begin to get arrogant, and then things go wrong. So they, say with under the monarchy, there is lots, I mean, kings like to think they've got it figured out. And so they can rule and everything will be hunky dory and their power will be assured. And then they get arrogant and they start thinking that they're actually the whole show. And again in the Hebrew Bible, God has a message for kings, often delivered by a prophet, that says, actually, you're not in charge. You need to remember that you're not God. It's like, not you. And um, I'm in charge. I'm God. So you need to learn to hold your power lightly. And then you need to remember that same thing about teach your children, that the law was actually there for your instruction. So it's not an accident in Deuteronomy that the law of the king is not actually all the details of holding power. The law of the king is you will read the law. That is the king's main responsibility in the law code of Deuteronomy. Is in Deuteronomy 17. What the king needs to do is hold the law close to their heart, because the law, in that sense, in the Hebrew Bible sense, the law is God's gift for how the people of God live out what it means to be the people of God. So when people, and particularly kings, people in power are most tempted to do this. And in the New Testament era, it was absolutely the Roman Empire, but it was also the leaders of the Jewish community. If they were trying to cooperate with the Romans, which on one level, politically smart, don't get the Romans chopping your heads off. That's not a good idea. But any holding on to power is often fatal to listening to God. And so whether it's Old Testament, New Testament, the listening to God has to come first.
Mm.
And when one does that, then the institutions that, you have to set up, temples and monarchies and village structures, etc., all of those need to be in the service of being God's people, listening to God. Following Jesus would be the New Testament metaphor for that, because nothing is in fact ever going to stay the same. That you are going to be living in a world, certainly in the ancient world, where empires come and go, and the little peoples and the little states that are under those empires are going to be impacted by those empires and going to have to always make decisions on how do we survive and whatever. And if we put our own understandings of power under that imperial uh, section, imperial reality, we're going to be tempted to forget God and think that we can figure it out on our own. And God comes along and says, nope, you're not going to be able to figure it out on your own. And in fact, if you go down that path, and this is really the case study, really is Jeremiah, because the monarchy in Jeremiah's time was kind of hell-bent on ignoring God's word and trying to figure out how they were going to, negotiate the incredibly complex imperial politics of the day. And Jeremiah keeps standing up and saying, no, you got to listen to God. No, you got to listen to God. And the kings keep saying, no, 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 we got this figured out. God's on our side. Don't worry about it. We got it figured out. And then the whole thing comes crashing down because they weren't listening to God. That was only one moment of the kinds, that was the most abrupt change, but that was certainly change. All of a sudden, literally crashing down on top of you. And then the elites are carried into exile. The poor people stay on the land trying to, farm the land for their new masters, which happened to be Babylonians for a while. But even after that point, so after the exile, they are returned by the Persian Empire, I might say, returned to Jerusalem. But that does not become heaven on earth. That becomes just another context where they need to keep listening to God. And so the next, so they kind of start coming back to Jerusalem 500 or so. And, but the next 500 years are constant change, are constant. You have got to keep listening to God because every time you turn around, something is changing. But you can still be God's people if you keep listening to God. And so you have the stories of people like an Esther, who is trying to survive as a Jewish people in a context which is terribly dangerous for Jews. And she finds a way to be faithful and then basically saves her people. And the phrase there, you are the right person for such a time as this, that's a phrase I think we need to remember because it automatically indicates for such a time as this might be a different time than what's going to happen 2 years from now. That's going to be its own such a time as this. And I said it, and when I preached at Knox College last week, that, to the students, so you're preparing for a church that's very different than the church was even 20 years ago. And if your, program at Knox or VST or PC College is good, and I think most of they're trying to prepare you for a church that's different than the one you might have experienced before. But it's equally true that the church 20 years from now is not going to be the church you're confronting today. So, and I think throughout the Hebrew Bible, and I would say the New Testament, if read with the proper, with good interpretive principles, that is not looking for what do we establish for all time and all places, but rather, how do the people of God keep adapting? How do they keep following God? How do they keep listening? How do they keep being sensitive to the working of the Holy Spirit in their lives, which is what Jesus promises us? You will have a comforter that is going to accompany you. I will always be with you. That if we actually trust that, then every moment when we're confronted with something new or a different decision or change or whatever, it doesn't depend on what we were in the past to respond. It depends on how are we following God now. And that we actually trust that the Spirit is in the room with us, that Jesus is praying for us, that Jesus is still leading the way. And that trust means that literally we can be ready for anything, because if you're not going to survive. So there's some
So
little nugget of biblical wisdom for you.
I love it. I love it. Yes, absolutely. Well, maybe for such a time as this, since you use that expression, it's one of my favorites. Um, the you've referenced hope and possibility, the narratives of hope and possibility a few
Right.
times. Um, I don't want to put you in any spot to share anything,
Right.
outside of school that you
Right.
may be aware of, being the moderator, because I'm sure
Right.
you're aware of some things that not all of us are in the Ministry Forum podcast are
Right.
aware of. But we're looking forward to hearing in some
Right.
iteration over the coming months. But for such a time as this, from what you've gleaned, maybe if you want to locate it solely in the workshops you've had and
Right.
the material you've come out with, or what you've been sort of picking up along the way,
Right.
what do you think what's your hope for the narratives of hope and
Right.
possibility for our denomination
Right.
for such a time as this?
Yeah. So I haven't read even the draft of the final report yet. I know it's going to Assembly Council, which is meeting this week, and I haven't read it. Just I didn't have time. So I can't tell you anything about what they're reporting because I haven't read the thing. And it's just a draft so I really only can talk from the experience in the workshops, which is really my thing to do. I deliberately did not. I was not on the committee. Was not on the working group. Didn't want to be. Didn't. I mean, that would have been like, nope, too much. I got my own things to do. As well as I think my doing these workshops as an independent voice was, I think, very useful. Although we coordinated, but it's like parallel paths that are in coordination with each other, and so when I would do a workshop, I always got good feedback from the workshop. I would save it, but I'd also send it to the working group. So Jean Morris got all of the feedback from the small groups, because that I think has been helpful for them. What's out there, like on the ground in the churches. And that was very important for them to know. So I have
Mm.
no idea what they're reporting. I do know their mandate, so that was, read that from the General Assembly, was to deal with all levels of the church, so local congregations, presbyteries, synods, and the national church, the national office. And I was not trying to do that. My workshops were necessarily focused on local congregations and maybe presbyteries, because I was always trying, when I gathered these workshops together, I always encourage, and most of them were this. However many churches in a local presbytery or a couple of presbyteries wanted to gather together for the workshop. So what I can see from the workshops is very similar. So I like what I was talking about, getting enough of a center of gravity together, I think, is one of the gleanings of the workshops. There are absolutely a number of congregations out there that are terribly discouraged and very frightened about what their future is going to be. They're wary of whether somebody's going to come along and force them to shut down. But even besides that, I think they know, even if an outside force doesn't do that, their own folks are going to get to the point where they're too old and too tired and too small. And of those things, the too tired may be the one that does us in,
Mm.
or does in a particular congregation. Because if you think about the volunteer base of a congregation, a healthy congregation will have quite a few volunteers in leadership of one kind or another. And that volunteer base will be across different ages and different groups and different people. But when a congregation gets too small, the volunteer base becomes the same 6 people doing everything. And that's just a recipe for stress and exhaustion. And that, in my experience, is where a congregation, regardless of the outside forces, a congregation gets to a point that says we are too tired to continue. So, and I think there are congregations that either see that already or are very afraid that that's soon in their future. And I think they're being realistic that that is in fact, and that they can't just say, well, it's not helpful to say, well, if we only had a youth group, because you may not have the wherewithal to have a youth group. So there is definitely out there in the church, and I've, in the workshops that I've done, I've seen that and listened empathetically, compassionately to people express that. I have also, however, seen that there are a lot of initiatives out there. There are some congregations that are absolutely thriving. There are congregations that are enlivening one little piece of ministry that may, in some cases, be a legacy, maybe from before a COVID time, but they're trying it in a new way and realizing, oh, this still works, or we can change it this way and that way, and it's still a good thing to do. So there are lots of sprouts and seedlings. I mean, I'm searching for metaphors here.
It's a good one. Yeah.
Sprouts and seedlings of new possibility, innovations. Let's just try something. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. So I'm not by no means hopeless about the future of the church. However, what I said about the fact I think the church will look very different 20 years from now than it does today is going to be absolutely the case. But that church 20 years from now might actually have a lot of vitality. I think it will be smaller in the terms of fewer congregations, but the congregations that are there might be quite lively and quite engaged with their communities and quite interested in doing mission and good worship and music, or, kind of whatever is the kinds of expression of the life of Christ in their midst that they're wanting to pursue. The other thing I think is absolutely the case, none of that is going to look like anything else. That there could be lots and lots and lots of different ways to be church, lots of different ways to be faithful to the call of Christ, lots of different ways to do mission in today's world. That there absolutely, we do not need to think that there is one solution that fits everyone. And that's then circling back to the need to be flexible and to realize that no matter what confronts us or the changes that we need to take on, if we stay connected to God and listening to God and trusting the Spirit, trusting that Jesus walks with us, we can do all things through the one who strengthens us. And that is going to be our best hope, is actually coming back to be a church that trusts its Lord. And trusting God, following Jesus, the comfort and challenge of the Holy Spirit is what is going to be needed to move us into the future. And that is not a future we're going to be able to predict. It's going to be a future that is particular to different contexts. But in those contexts, amazing ministry can get done. And so I'm very hopeful about the future of the church, as long as people are realizing it ain't going to look anything like what it is now, and it ain't going to look like anything like what it used to look like. Why would we expect that?
Yeah, it's almost like similar to what you were talking about, where maybe around power a little bit. With power, so what comes along with power sometimes is it's the financial stability, membership stability, growth, and things like that. And I think many of the people in the church and what was formulated for the church say from the 1950s into the early 2000s, perhaps,
Right.
was a sense of like, this is how you do church. And so
Right.
all of our structures were designed to serve that kind of model. Um, I've known, with no due disrespect to the Presbyterian Church in Canada, there is a sense, because I hear it from people in congregations who say, a church that's vacant.
Right.
Well, there's 20 of you who come to this building every Sunday. It's not vacant. Yeah, but
Right.
we don't have a minute. We're not a real church. We don't have a minister.
Right.
We don't have this.
Yep.
And so when we fixate on all those things that are the definitions, there's sort of a sense of like all of that's been broken open.
Hmm.
Maybe it was the pandemic. Maybe I think there's some good people like Dr. Stuart McDonald who would say this
Hmm.
has been breaking open for a very long
Right.
time. We just took a
Yep.
long time to
Figure
actually
it
hear
out.
it,
Yep.
to listen to
Yes.
God.
Yep.
We just weren't listening. We were thinking, oh no, it's going to change. Like, because
Right.
when I started in ministry in the late 90s, we were talking then about the church is losing its Christian memory. People
Right.
don't people are losing their Christian memory. But in my time in ministry, if I couldn't use those words now. There is no
Right.
Christian memory. That
Right.
doesn't exist in the same
Right.
way.
Right.
Um, and even the people in the church. So the thing I used to use in the congregation that I served the longest was the ladies' parlor. It was called the ladies' parlor. And I used to, every so often, I'd be sitting in that room, and some of these naughty elders of the church decided that we would have wine
In the
and cheese
ooh,
in that
in the
sacred
ladies'
room.
parlor. Ooh.
Exactly. And it would be mostly women of the church, at a Bible study or at a book club or something like that.
Right.
And every so often it would just come to mind, and I'd be like, when they would talk about change and the way the
Right.
church was, and I'm like, friends, we are sitting in the ladies' parlor drinking wine, and you all are wearing pants
Right.
and no hats and gloves and
Right.
nothing like this.
Yes.
Like, can you imagine if your grandparents or even your parents
Right.
were in this space right now? This would not be the
Right.
appropriate way to be in this church or in
Yep.
this building. And so change has been happening all along. We
Yeah.
just don't always pay attention to it, I think,
Right.
is
Right.
part of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
As we wrap up, Pat, this episode we hope to release on April 1st, which
Right.
is a special day in the PCC, not only because it's April
April
Fool's Day,
Fool's
but it's
Day.
that wonderful day when moderators get told, or future moderators get told, "Hey, giddy up! This is
That's right. It's
you're
you.
about to start. It's you." So I'm confident that you've marked this day on your
Mhm.
calendar quite intensely,
Yep.
as the day that your life was transformed, but also as
Yep.
the day when all this ends,
Right.
or
Exactly.
begins to
The
end.
end is in sight. Yes.
The end is nigh.
Right.
So, any advice for the new moderator, if they're listening? Any thoughts you'd want to share, even for the church, of how to care for a moderator or
Mm. Oh,
support or
that's
encourage a
interesting.
moderator in their roles? Yeah, you've
Yeah.
said that as a moderator, you felt like you're carrying the whole PCC as your
Right.
congregation. So that's a lot to carry.
Right.
How would
Yeah.
you both encourage a new moderator and encourage the church to look out for their moderator?
Uh, yeah, I guess I mean, kind of picking up on some ideas we said earlier, be ready for anything. It's going to be probably at least a little different than you expect. I think the impact of the working group of narratives of hope and possibility will impact the moderatorial ship of the next several years. So be ready to work with that, I think is important. But the other thing is to know, absolutely, you are not doing this alone. So, I mean, that impression where, I feel like, oh my God, I have the burden of the whole church. It's absolutely not. I mean, there are structures that actually help the moderator tremendously. The General Assembly office is incredibly helpful, as are other folks at the national staff offices. And then there is just so much goodwill in the church for the moderator and the role that they play, and so many good people welcoming you when you visit and setting up lovely meet and greets and receptions and conversations, and it's just, you are not alone in the work you have to do. You are well supported by lovely people who really, really want to hear what the moderator has to say, but also are really there to support what the moderator does. It's a peculiarly Presbyterian thing, but the church still recognizes that moderators are playing a role and that it's kind of good to support them and in fact kind of delightful to support them.
That's
So I guess
beautiful.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Pat, is there anything I haven't asked you that you were hoping I would?
No, I think we have talked about the kinds of things that in my mind have been actually a nice kind of review of the year, which is kind of nice that it kind of falls at this point because I'm,
Mm,
3/4 of the way through the year, and it's nice to have a moment to reflect on it. So I want to thank you for inviting me to the ministry forum. It's great.
yeah, thanks, Pat, and enjoy your time in the Maritimes. I've had the pleasure of being down there for the Synod of the Atlantic Provinces
Hmm.
a couple of times now,
Yeah,
and just a great, beautiful
yeah,
community of people
yeah.
serving in varieties of different situations, and certainly hospitality is key
Yes. Oh, yeah,
when you get there.
absolutely.
You'll be well
I
taken
am
care of.
looking forward to lobster. I don't
Yes,
even know if
indeed.
it's lobster season, but I'm looking forward to it anyway.
I'm sure they'll find some kind of lobster for the moderator. They've been saving it all year for you,
All
maybe. Who
year,
knows?
right?
Yeah,
Indeed.
who knows? Who
Right.
knows? Pat, thank you so much for everything you do in the church and all the spaces you've turned up to throughout your calling in life. And we're
Mhm.
delighted that you are our moderator of the 149th General Assembly. And
Right.
on a personal note, I'm also happy the way in which you've fully demonstrated being a servant of the church, a servant of Christ in everything that
Mm.
you've done. I'm grateful that you also have it. You'll also be invited into a season of laying that down or
Right.
resting from that,
Yeah.
and I'm sure you'll pick up many other things. But still,
Yeah. Right.
resting from this piece and this season
Right.
of ministry in your life,
Yes.
such a gift you've been to the church.
Right.
So thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for the ministry forum and this chance to have a good conversation.
Thanks for joining us today on the Ministry Forum podcast. We hope today's episode resonated with you and sparked your curiosity. Remember, you're not alone in your ministry journey. We're at the other end of some form of technology, and our team is committed to working hard to support your ministry every step of the way. If you enjoyed today's episode, tell your friends, your family, your colleagues. Tell someone. Please don't keep us a secret. And of course, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review in the places you listen to podcasts. Your feedback helps us reach more ministry leaders just like you. And honestly, it reminds us that we're not alone either. And don't forget to follow us on social media at Ministry Forum on all of our channels. You can visit our website at ministryforum.ca for more resources, keeping up with upcoming events, and ways to connect with our growing community. Until next time, may God's strength and courage be yours in all that you do. May you be fearless, not reckless, and may you be well in body, mind, and spirit, and may you be at